So today's keynote is entitled Feeding the World Silicon Valley Style, Place, Promise, and the Future of Protein. Alexandra, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. So I will attempt to share my screen. So hopefully you will see a presentation. Great. So thank you so much, Andrea. What a pleasure it is to be here. And thank you to Andrea and the other organisers for inviting me to speak today, and also for accommodating the change to the programme. Sadly, I will be attending a family funeral tomorrow, which is why I'm speaking today. So I just wanted to express my thanks again to Andrea and to Carolyn for allowing me to swap the days that we were scheduled to talk. And I hope that it hasn't caused too much inconvenience for everybody. So I'm absolutely delighted to be joining the conference and feel really honoured to have been invited to give this talk. It's such a shame not to be with you all in person and not to be in Ljubljana. I've long wanted to visit, but hopefully there'll be opportunity in the future. I've been really excited for the conference this week. What a brilliant programme of sessions we have over the coming days, and on such a timely and fascinating theme. It's a theme that has been at the centre of my research for a long time, so I'm also just really delighted to have the opportunity to share some of this work with you. So, in trying to decide where to start my talk today, I came back to an observation from my own personal life and experiences as a millennial who loves food, and just reflecting on how even in my lifetime, the way that I interact with food has changed quite radically. New media, such as social media platforms and other digital spaces, as we all know, have become a major mediator of how we all consume food today. And we can see these changes reflected in the titles of some of the talks that will be taking place over the coming days, which I'm really looking forward to. These new media have changed our relationships with food, how we understand and value it, how we connect or perhaps increasingly disconnect with where it comes from and who produced it. And while there are many instances where the internet and certain apps have given new opportunities to share our food cultures, campaign for food justice, and even redistribute food to those most in need, in many other ways, the digital reimagining of food has placed another medium, another layer of fetishization and physical disconnection, and another layer of stakeholders and often corporate interests in between us as an eater and the places, people, and networks of things that go into making and consuming food. This distancing has led some to characterize modern food systems as becoming increasingly disconnected and dematerialized. And this relationship between the material and immaterial in the context of food futures is what I'll be focusing on today. So my work focuses on a particular encounter of the digital with food, a much messier and perhaps more material encounter, even though materiality often isn't acknowledged in the stories told about it. It's an encounter that has also involved a very specific place in the world. Over the last decade, Silicon Valley, which is the high-tech industrial region around the San Francisco Bay Area in California, has become a leading hub of attempts to develop foods of the future. Now, this region is famed for some of the most powerful tech companies that operate primarily in the immaterial realms of code and algorithms. Over the last few decades in the internet age, they have invented a new kind of business model, the digital platform, and in turn created new forms of value through our attention, our likes, and our personal data. These platforms aren't really an end product for us to consume in the traditional sense, but rather a mediator through which we use to consume other people's products and content. Digital platforms have perpetuated this sense of Silicon Valley as an industry of the immaterial world, and that their particular model of disruption is often to dematerialize conventional business models. In their book, Silicon Valley of Dreams, which is a critique of the environmental and social inequalities perpetuated by the high-tech industry. The authors, Pellow and Park, so this is the top quote at the top of the screen here, they open with this quote that captures the image of high-tech as a clean and immaterial industry. So it says, in the public consciousness, high-tech is the antithesis of that old-fashioned, fossil fuel-driven industry. The news media normally discuss the new technologies as digitally clean, trafficking in information rather than goods, thriving on creativity rather than muscle. But as the authors argue, that's a mirage. And we're going to hang on to this idea as we go through the talk. Until very recently, food was way off the radar of this particular tech elite. Yes, there are apps to help you get your food delivered or review your favorite restaurant, but tech companies actually producing food products was really not being done. Investors were nervous in the beginning, as this quote at the bottom of the screen from one of my fieldwork interviews describes. Food wasn't really seen as sexy enough, and it was too much of the real world. But despite this, and as I'll go on to talk about, Silicon Valley has become a hotbed of food innovation in recent years. In particular, it became a key region of activity early on in the evolution of the recent alternative protein industry from around 2010 onwards, and that's the focus of my research. And many of the success stories of this new industry are either still based in the area or tied to it through investment. So what do I mean by alternative proteins? This term is not without its problems, but it's one that has come to be used to try and capture a broad spectrum of products. My work tends to focus on two broad approaches. So the first is the new generation of plant-based substitutes, particularly plant-based meats. So I'm sure you're aware that plant-based alternatives for meat have a very long history across different cultures. And in recent decades, brands like Quorn in the UK and Morningstar Farms in the US have pushed the simulation further by making plants and fungi mimic the shapes and sensory properties of burgers, nuggets, and sausages. The latest generation of companies are pushing this simulation even further to try and be indistinguishable from their meaty counterparts. Pushing the textures further, using big data to screen across thousands of ingredients for their sensory and functional properties, and even making plant-based blood so the products bleed like meat. You may have heard of some of these companies. Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods in the US have become the kind of flagship brands of this latest generation, but it is a constantly expanding category with startups seeming to launch every week around the world. The other broad category of alternative proteins that my work focuses on has been termed cellular agriculture. So this is your lab-grown meats, milks, eggs, and all kinds of animal-derived products, both edible and non-edible. Very simply, you can divide cellular agriculture into two broad technological approaches. So the first one is the process generally used for creating meat. So this tends to involve either taking a biopsy of cells from an animal or taking cells from a cell bank, and then placing these in a growth medium and incubating them in a bioreactor. The cells start to multiply and form into bigger muscle strands, a bit like minced meat, which can then be collected to form products like burgers and sausages. More complex structures are currently being developed to try and produce bigger cuts of meat like chicken breasts and steaks. The other approach that falls under the cellular agriculture family is fermentation-based cellular agriculture. So this approach has been used to make cultured milk and egg whites, amongst other products. This method doesn't involve animal cells, but instead microorganisms such as yeast or fungi are genetically reprogrammed to produce the desired protein needed to build things like milk or egg whites from the bottom up. So for example, when you traditionally ferment yeast, the cells produce alcohol. The idea here is if you insert the genetic blueprint for, say, whey or casein, the yeast cells, when fermented, instead of producing alcohol, will produce the whey or the casein instead. You can then add lipids, water, sugars, etc., to build things like cow's milk without the cow. And just a quick note here on terminology. So it's likely if you've come across these products in the media over recent years, you may have heard them called lots of different names. These are some of the main examples in the middle of the slide of what cell-cultured meat has been called. And it has been a highly contested part of how the industry has made sense of its own products, but also importantly, how publics beyond the industry have tried to make sense of what these products are and what they mean for the future of food, with some less kind versions like Frankenmeat sometimes doing the rounds. Neil Stevens' work on the naming of cultured meat is a great place to start if you're interested in this aspect of framing around alternative proteins. So my turn to alternative proteins began in 2013, which quite serendipitously turned out to be a key year for this new industry. It was the year Bill Gates, founder of Microsoft, declared that food was ripe for reinvention in a blog post that came to be quite a rallying cry amongst the Silicon Valley and broader alternative protein community. It turned out that Gates had also invested in two little-known alternative protein companies called Beyond Meat, which is making plant-based meats, and Hampton Creek, which is now rebranded as Eat Just. They make plant-based egg products and have since expanded into cell-cultured meat. And they were both starting to make headlines for their new approaches to making animal-based foods around this time. This was also the year that saw the first ever public tasting of a cell-cultured burger. In what remains one of the most high-profile events in the cultured meat industry, this event occurred in a television studio in West London. The burger was created by Professor of Vascular Physiology, Mark Post from Maastricht University. The chef cooked the burger and it was tasted by two food industry professionals. The burger cost reportedly around 250,000 euros to make. And the taste verdict was not so bad, a good texture, but lacking a bit of flavour as it was pure cultured muscle tissue. There was no fat in it. Around the same time this was all happening, I was following the live updates from the other side of London whilst moving into my flat and getting ready to start my PhD. This overlap of timelines has been a feature of my research from the beginning. I've been researching these foods of the future as they've been in a constant and fluid state of becoming in the present. It's meant almost a decade of a constantly shifting and accelerating research landscape that has been equal parts exciting and overwhelming to keep up with. At the same time, the emergence of these future foods has also pulled on threads that point backwards in time, conjuring powerful origin stories through quotes like this, an extract from an essay about the future that UK Prime Minister Winston Churchill wrote in 1931. In it, he predicts the evolution of cultured meat production, stating that we will escape the absurdity of growing a whole chicken in order to eat the breast or wing by growing these parts separately in a suitable medium. Like the imagined futures that have been so prevalent in this industry, these collected histories have also done important work to legitimize these technologies as part of a longer story of moral and scientific progress, and also to add a sprinkling of wonder, romanticism, and good old-fashioned sci-fi intrigue to the mix. There's also been some fascinating work by literary scholars who have broadened the historical storying of particularly cultured meat, looking across fictional references. Here are just a few of the novels, essays, and films that have been examined. Each reference to cultured meat is slightly different, but often all act as a device to reflect upon human relationships to nature. Sometimes, as in the headless but still living chickens of Oryx and Crake, they can represent an unsettling culmination of human desire for eating animal flesh, but trying to engineer our guilt out of the process. Or, as Susan McHugh describes, a sense of gone-wrongedness in the environmental relations across species as characteristic of modern living. There are more utopian depictions where cultured meat is used as a symbol of humans transcending scarcity and disease through technology. But in his work, John Miller notes that these ideas of cleanness can have sinister racist and fascist undertones and sometimes depict a world devoid of any animals, which may not be so desirable. And other stories play with the possibilities for technologies like cultured meat to get around the speciesist hierarchy, where we can end up consuming ourselves, literally through culturing human flesh. Nora Castle, who I believe is speaking at this conference, and Josh Milburn, who's at Sheffield, have done some really interesting recent work on these themes. These entanglements of histories, presents, and futures reflect the particular melting pot of my own academic training. I initially studied ancient history, which might make you ask, how has an ancient historian ended up studying the future of food? It's a question I've often asked myself and often had to justify when applying for degrees since then. I studied history because I was fascinated by stories of people and cultures, and also how history is used in the present for political and cultural purposes, and the effects this can have on which stories are told, which are forgotten, and the imagined societies this collectively works to create. The shift to becoming a geographer was a way to ground these stories in place and across scale, and to focus more specifically on the politics inherent to the stories that are told about the world today. As I was thinking of ideas for a PhD project, my supervisor said he'd read something about this sci-fi thing called in vitro meat, which was one of the earlier terms for cultured meat. I was immediately hooked and went on to complete a PhD in human geography at King's College London, beginning my journey of being a geographer and of exploring what these products mean for the future of food and farming, and more broadly for the future of society and the planet. The way I first encountered these products was through the hype that their creators and the media were generating. This kind of hype is often referred to as promissory narratives in social science work. The key strand of social science work on alternative proteins, including my own, has examined these promissory narratives. And what's been interesting to observe is that over their short history, many of these products have existed more as narratives than as physical, eatable food products. So they've existed more as promises of what they will achieve in the future than as material things in the present. And underpinning many of these narratives has been the promise of dematerialization, as Guthman and Biltokoff have argued. And what they mean is the promise of making food from significantly fewer resources, as you'll see at the bottom right there, even from thin air in one case, but also the promise of having a marginal material footprint on the world. So put another way, it's the ultimate end goal of techno-scientific mastery over nature, of rendering the messy, material, biological world more rational, more efficient, and more immaterial through technology. And the particular flavour that Silicon Valley has given this broader trajectory towards techno-dematerialization is the idea that you take protein production out of the fields, out of animal bodies, and relocate it to the world of data and high-tech startups. The idea, as one recent industry report put it, is to reimagine food as software. So this is a pretty extraordinary vision, right? That we are looking at a future where protein foods have become increasingly dematerialized, perhaps to the point where we're making them out of thin air. But is this actually a case of dematerialization, or rather a reorganizing of very real and very material systems that make up modern food production and consumption? While alternative proteins may have today existed more as narratives about the future, they have done significant work in the present to reorganize and redefine what we think modern food systems should look like, who we want to be in control of our food, and what role technology and capitalism should play in these futures. What I'm arguing then is that we cannot understand the promissory power of alternative proteins and really what they mean for the future of food without understanding them as a relationship between materiality and discourse. So this idea follows the general trend of rematerialization in social science and humanities thinking over recent years, which has sought to emphasize how discourses and representations are always entangled with materiality. What I want to focus on today are two particular examples of materiality. So I want to ask the two questions of whether place matters and whether bodies, and in this case I focus on human bodies, matter in the politics and evolution of food futures. Can we think of discourses having place? What happens when narratives about future foods meet the visceral realm of eating and bodies? And the big so what question from this work is this: what role do materialities such as these play in shaping the politics of the possible for the future of food? So that's a fancy way of saying Do places and bodies open up or shut down what is thought to be possible when we're trying to rethink the food system? Do they shape who gets to decide what is possible and what solutions are perhaps overlooked? So hopefully this talk will offer some conceptual reflections of how we can think more about the role of place and bodies in research on food and communication, and also use these themes to critically reflect on the consequences this has for how the future of food is talked about, but also how it might come to be politically, economically, and socially organised. So does place matter? There has been a sense for some time now in academic and public narratives that we are moving increasingly towards a more globalised, placeless, Internet of Things organisation of the world. A sense that everything is flattening into one economic space, as Gibbs and Graham have put it. This kind of cultural imperialism, of course, predates the internet and social media, but the internet age has undoubtedly accelerated this idea that we have transcended place and even materiality. In the context of food, we can now share a photo of a meal in an instant across the world, become a click activist on food-related injustices without stepping on a picket line, and become a new kind of global entrepreneurial self as a digital food influencer from our bedrooms. The recent stories being told about the planet and the role of food in its destruction have also become increasingly globalized in their framing. The narratives often start from a fear of global population running out of control, and in doing so, a fear that we will exceed what have been identified as various planetary boundaries, many of which we have already breached. In response, some have attempted to create a planetary diet, as you see in this image, a plate that connects us to a global sense of responsibility, where our individual choices on what's hopefully a daily basis are linked to the larger welfare of the social and ecological body of the planet. An outcome of these global narratives on the future of food in recent years has been that certain food groups have been spotlighted for being greater drivers of damage to both planetary and human health, with meat often the worst culprit in many scientific, policy, and media narratives. And within the category of meat, it's ruminants, and particularly cows, that are identified as the worst offenders for the environment and for human health. They have in many ways become the symbol of a broken modern food system and of a looming planetary apocalypse, as the artwork for this recent Channel 4 documentary in the UK dramatically shows. And it's these messages that I've frequently encountered in the framings of recent alternative proteins. Here are some extracts from alternative protein websites that I've studied in my work. So this is how the industry has often communicated and diagnosed the role animal agriculture is playing in current planetary crises. They sometimes use statistics in these framings, some of which have been contested in the scientific community. It can sometimes be unclear which type of conventional farming system is being compared in these narratives, or often the worst offending version of conventional animal farming is used to draw comparisons with the merits of alternative proteins. Now, while I'm not certainly trying to dispute the problematic footprint of much of modern animal agriculture, it's important to reflect on which numbers and what kinds of comparisons are being used to build this story of alternative proteins as promising a better future of food. It has been clear that the story has tended to see animal agriculture as a global force, which undeniably it is. But animal agriculture is also a melting pot of different farming methods, scales of production, cultural traditions, livelihood dependencies, and environmental impacts. Skipping this nuance allows for a more simplified protagonist narrative, where the global universal animal is presented as the broken part of the food system. In other narratives from the alternative protein industry, animals have been framed as an outdated technology. And if humans were designing the food system from scratch today, science, meaning Western science, would have more logical and efficient ways to do it. So this is the backdrop against which we got Bill Gates' rallying cry in 2013 that food was ripe for reinvention. And it's a story that generally operates at the scale of the planet, both in terms of the crises we face and the scale at which any potential solutions need to be able to operate. A solution that can scale up its production quickly to allow a global community to easily make the switch in their daily lives. Yet at the same time, alternative proteins have existed in these globalized narratives and promises. There have been some more localized material changes also occurring. Companies have formed, substantial money has been invested, professional conferences have brought attention and a sense of community to the sector. This institutional landscape map made by newmeat.org gives a snapshot of what this community looked like in 2018. So you'll see at the top of the slide, the startups that were operating at this time, then in the middle, the kind of institutional support from tech accelerators and academic research groups and some non-profit advocacy groups. And then at the bottom, the investors, so made up of venture capitalists, a few philanthropic billionaires, and then the entry of traditional food industry at the bottom right here, which signaled a key juncture in the so-called disruptive journey of this new sector. And I'll come back to this. So to give a sense of how rapidly this community has been growing over a very short time frame, this is another snapshot of the sector 2 years later in 2020. So there's been considerable expansion across all categories. And over the same time frame, some key firsts for the sector have occurred. Beyond Meat was the first plant-based company to go public on the New York Stock Exchange. The first cultured meat was grown in space by Israel-based company Aleph Farms. This is a kind of future vision of that. It didn't actually look like that. They grew it on the International Space Station. And Singapore became the first country to grant regulatory approval of cultured meat for public sale. And that's just a few of the many headline events that have happened over the last couple of years. What became apparent early on in my PhD, though, so around 2013, 2014, was that a lot of this early activity was starting to concentrate in the high-tech region of Silicon Valley. So this is a snapshot of just some of the cellular agriculture companies, investors, accelerators, and conferences that were operating in the area during my PhD, and many of which have since become leaders of their industry. So being a geographer, we have a bit of an obsession with place and space. And I wanted to understand whether place, and specifically the place of Silicon Valley, has played any kind of mediating role in how the vision of an alternative protein future has materialized. Has place mattered in how alternative proteins have developed as products and what is thought to be possible through their production? And the spoiler alert for that question is that my answer is yes, it has mattered. And this argument is based on a recent paper that I published in Economic Geography, which goes into more detail than I have time for today. But what I'll show in the next few slides is that it mattered quite a lot to the industry figures that I interviewed in Silicon Valley to be both physically and culturally in place within the region. I'll explain what I mean by that and then get to some of the so what reflections. But first, just a quick background on what I mean by place and some of the literatures that I've drawn on. So in both food geography and economic geography, there's been recent important work that has really pushed back at the idea that I referenced earlier of everything becoming flattened into one globalized culture and space. One strand of this work has been research on alternative food networks that have shown the continued importance of place despite increasingly globalized commodity approaches to food. So you can think of the rise in local food movements, farmers markets, vegetable box schemes. There has been a growing demand, albeit often for those who can afford it, for knowing and caring about the connections of food with place. The other strand of work I've looked to is research in critical economic geography that has challenged traditional cluster theories by showing that economic activity doesn't just happen on top of surfaces, but becomes infused with the character of places. So as Massi has talked about, we can instead think of places as having character, as having regional differences that are reflected in the industrial cultures and economic activity. The work of Noel Longhurst pushes this idea of the connection between place and innovation even further in his work on Totnes, a town in the UK associated with radical New Age beliefs and innovation. I've used his work to try and capture how a sense of place can infuse the culture of doing innovation and of imagining a new future for food. I focused in particular on two of his concepts. So the first he calls spatial imaginary. So this is how a place becomes seen as a good place for innovation. And the second he terms ontological and epistemological multiplicity. So this is basically how a place can cultivate a sense that there's no such thing as a bad idea. This is all quite conceptually heavy, but hopefully it will become clearer as I talk it through my empirical examples in the next few slides. So during my interviews and empirical work in Silicon Valley, I discovered the importance for the alternative protein industry to be physically in the place of this region early on in its evolution. So being there was seen to increase access to resources, particularly venture capital. I mentioned earlier that there was a geographical shift around the time that I started my PhD. This was in large part triggered by the lack of public funding for alternative protein development at the time. These technologies were too nascent and too risky for many public funds, and their particular form of food technology didn't often fit the siloed nature of academic funding grants. They were often too biotech for food grants and too foodie for biotech grants. Silicon Valley is famous for its large ecosystem of high-risk venture capital, and so this was a big draw for the early alternative protein industry. Other reasons my interviewees cited for moving there was also due to the particular talent pool in the area and the influential technology media scene that can help get their companies noticed by those with power and money. But the importance of being there went beyond just tangible and practical resources. A number of founders I spoke with referenced a kind of entrepreneurial spirit that infused the region, and that by being in the area, they could become the next big thing. To become, as one of my interviewees put it at the bottom here, the Uber or Airbnb of food. So this builds on a longer frontier narrative of the region that goes back to the Californian gold rush. So of taking a one-way ticket with just a suitcase and a big idea. And that kind of imaginary was actually reflected in an interview. So the top quote here was an interview with a CEO and founder of one of these alternative protein companies. So actually, directly sort of referencing that frontier kind of narrative. But being there wasn't just about how the entrepreneurs saw their own prospects increasing. It was also how other people viewed them and their ventures. As an investor told me, what Silicon Valley are very accustomed to is getting their companies noticed. If a venture capitalist in, let's say, Ecuador, decided that they wanted the same attention drawn to their investment, it wouldn't make it on the front page of the New York Times unless it's truly remarkable. But in Silicon Valley, it's a little bit easier to push that to the front page because there's some notoriety there, there's some cachet. So in other words, the same idea about a food innovation started in Silicon Valley is more likely to get noticed by the broader institutional networks of media and money, and in doing so gain legitimacy as an idea, than one started elsewhere, purely by where it is physically located. So what I found from these observations was that there was a powerful spatial imaginary at work across these institutional levels that positions Silicon Valley as the place where radical innovation occurs and is encouraged, and which collectively forms what I term a distinct terroir of innovation that sets alternative protein ventures there apart from those elsewhere. The consequences of this is that confidence in what alternative proteins can deliver is hugely shaped by where they have emerged. So place is a pivotal factor in their ongoing ontological politics, or in other words, how the products and the industry are materializing. But this wasn't the whole picture of how place was shaping what these alternative proteins are and how they were being developed. The second point I want to highlight is how the culture of innovation in Silicon Valley, so how innovation is thought about, communicated, and practiced, is another way that place has shaped the ontological possibilities of alternative proteins. So one founder of an alternative protein company told me, you have to be innovative in the right ways. So meaning the company had to be for profit based on a high-tech product that could be protected by intellectual property. The founder also described how being a white, heterosexual, educated male also made it substantially easier for him to operate within the norms of what tech innovators look like in the Valley and to access its spaces of power. And I'll come back to this point later. The majority of alternative protein ventures have followed this business model, and even when started in academic contexts, many have gone on to create for-profit spin-off companies from their research projects. One of the key factors that has biased the sector towards this particular business model is because of where its investment has come from. I was told by a venture capitalist that investors in the region like to invest in what they know, so calling it, they like to invest in their own backyard. So that's for-profit companies with intellectual property. But what they also tend to be most familiar with, so what they know, is tech companies. So many early alternative protein companies had to reframe what they were doing in the language of tech. So one alternative protein company told me that when we're talking to an investor, the focus shifts to technology. Because the investor sees a food company, that's not scalable. It's not going to be a unicorn. So that's when a company is valued at $1 billion. But when you talk about building databases, computational biology, then they think, wait, that's something that's scalable, like 400,000 plants in the world. You guys could license this out. That is what gets them excited more than just food as a product. So this is where you come back to the idea of food as software, which has been a prominent feature of the marketing of alternative proteins. You see here the Beyond Meat Burger launched their second generation product as Beyond Burger 2.0, which is a nod to the language used by companies like Apple when they bring out their new iPhone. You also see the food as software framing in influential reports about the industry. So in this recent Rethink report, they take the concept of food as software to the extreme, and this was the first place that I actually came across this food as software framing. So they talk about how the new model of food production and consumption that adopts certain principles of modern computing, like software, it will continually improve through iteration, and integration with information technology and the internet means that improvements in production methods or ingredients can be downloaded and incorporated almost instantaneously and become fully distributed and decentralized. So this is really coming back to this idea of dematerialization, a future of somehow uploading and downloading food and really moving production into a fully decentralized immaterial realm. So to make their vision of future proteins attractive to the institutional landscape of Silicon Valley, alternative proteins had to be framed as technology first and food second. They had to become culturally in place by fitting seamlessly within existing venture capitalist portfolios that favour high-tech ventures, as well as promise to deliver the same innovation and funding cycles expected of software startups. So how they were framed as narratives and promises had very real consequences then for their material outcomes as businesses and as viable foods of the future. So what does this all mean? Does it matter that the early stages of this industry were entangled with the high-tech culture of Silicon Valley? Well, I argue that it does matter in terms of what has been considered possible for the future of protein. The innovation terroir, as I call it, in Silicon Valley that I've described has very fixed ideas of what counts as a viable and successful innovation. It is, in a way, a cookie-cutter approach to future making. And despite what the region likes to portray, it rarely disrupts the overarching systems of modern life. It tinkers with the end products, but leaves intact the centrality of markets and individual consumption as the means to bring about radical change. And we're seeing this already in the alternative protein sector. So rather than David toppling Goliath, the Goliaths are already buying in and buying up the alternative protein industry. Now, I'm happy to discuss what I see as the pros and cons of this development, but my overall concern is that this particular future of protein is being driven by many of the stakeholders and the systems that arguably got us to this point of crisis. So the conceptual point I'm making is that where these technologies and food futures have developed has shaped both the perceptions and material outcomes of what they might achieve, and at the same time, crowded out alternative approaches that might be as or more effective. So that's thinking through the role of place and whether it matters. I now want to draw attention to the importance of bodies as another way of rematerializing these food futures. So I'm going to focus here on human bodies for time purposes, but there's lots we could also discuss about non-human bodies too, and great work is being done on this across social sciences and humanities. Now, forgive me if I am covering all ground in media and communication studies. I've read lots of great work that examines and theorizes how different media have affective power. So how media can have emotional and physical impacts on our bodies as we consume or interact with them. Also, more broadly, and there are many talks on this at the conference over the next few days, there's great work looking at how food can act as a site of constructing, diminishing, and reappropriating notions of race, gender, class, sexuality, and selfhood. Food discourses then can construct ideas about our bodies and our identities, which in turn can have affective power on our bodies. Narratives are felt in and through the body. So how might narratives about food futures be felt? Where does the body feature, or perhaps is made to not feature? In the context of alternative proteins, one of the most reported ways this food future has been felt in public narratives is disgust. You might have heard it called the yuck factor. There's been quite a bit of consumer-focused research that has worked to find out what people think about growing meat from cells or plants and whether they'd eat them. But a lot of this work has only asked people in hypothetical scenarios. Asking people if they would hypothetically eat a novel food product in an academic type environment is not really going to capture the messiness and fluidity of everyday food choices. Work by sociologists and food geographers on practice theory and the attitude behavior gap shows that we can be told how a food is the better option, that it is safe, and that it will taste delicious. And we might even believe that and say we will choose it. But when you actually follow those same people doing their food shops, when they are juggling the ever-changing and competing pressures of hunger, price, time, convenience, accessibility, and when the food environment is also constantly changing and industries have spent millions of dollars trying to influence our decisions, those same people don't always reflect their attitudes in their behavior. So this is why many of the alternative protein companies have not just relied on telling us that their products are better. They are also constantly trying to show us through the sensory experience of their products too, that these are products that aren't just good for the planet and good for our health, but also are good to eat. Indeed, the fact that they promise equivalent or better taste experiences has, as I've argued elsewhere, created a new moral challenge for us as eaters. If it tastes just as good and is good for the planet, animals, and our health, then why wouldn't we make the switch? Do we become bad eaters if we don't choose these versions of so-called good meat? There is a high bar in our sensory expectations of animal foods, and they are very personal and culturally embedded expectations. These visceral expectations are more than just the act of eating as well. They extend to the whole performance of food-based practices, so how we shop, prepare, cook, and serve food, either individually or as collectives. And even if the individual product hits this high sensory bar, if the broader thought of treating food like software is simply too disgusting, then the body can be a powerful site of resistance against food technologies. We've seen it with GM foods, and it is a very real threat to alternative proteins. The point here then is we are not rendered entirely passive by the overtly positive narratives of these food futures. The narratives act on and through us as eaters and are met with emotional, precognitive, culturally situated responses that may resist the hype. This is important to reflect on, not just for trying to predict who and how many people may accept these novel foods, but can also help to understand why certain people may resist them. It might be simply because of the taste, or it might be because treating food like software threatens a person's cultural identity, their way of life, or their values of what they think food is and should be. There has been a lot of polarization in the discourses on alternative proteins, but more often than not pit vegan tech bros against livestock farmers, with misunderstandings and mischaracterizations on both sides. Understanding how discourses about food futures are felt viscerally and emotionally by different people can, I argue, help to unpack in more constructive and empathetic ways where and why resistances are occurring, and what is sensed as being under threat by these food futures. I've written about this recently, and there's now analyses starting to be done that are looking more seriously about how existing producers might be affected. And this is the area that my current work is focused on that was mentioned in the introduction. Another way food futures have affective power over bodies is through their organisation of people and networks across space. So here we return to the idea that we started with at the beginning of this talk about the image of digital cleanliness and immaterial operations that the high-tech industry has enjoyed. It's an image that the industry has historically perpetuated about itself, but also local governments and media have been eager to emphasise it as well, particularly during the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, when high-tech offered new opportunities, particularly for the San Francisco Bay Area, for a new and competitive kind of post-industrial growth. Yet the material legacy of the high-tech industry is becoming increasingly hard to ignore. From the ecological disasters of rare earth mining for our digital devices, to the toxic pollution and ecological destruction of communities in the valley area itself. First through the waste that came from the semiconductor industries, and more recently the air pollution of internet company servers, the overdevelopment of green spaces, and increased traffic pollution. Throughout the region's industrial history, much of these impacts have hit lower income communities and people of colour in the region the hardest. So, in the context of food futures, we should be asking, how are different bodies being reordered or organised through these food futures? And how do food futures materialise in and through the labour, well-being and opportunities of different bodies? This familiar promise of clean industry is very clear in the visions of future alternative protein production lines. So this is a kind of imagined production line from the company MeatTech in Europe. So this prompts questions about what type of cleanliness is being evoked here and who will it be clean for? What do the spaces of production for plant-based meats and milks already look like, and where are they? Whose labour is or isn't included, and who does and doesn't benefit from that labour? Will there even be bodies in the picture, So referencing the seemingly largely automated vision that you see in the image there. Will there be environmental and economic fallout from these processes that we don't yet know about? And will the most vulnerable again be the ones who feel it most? And in terms of shaping the directions of this new industry, what space is made for different voices in its positions of power? Also, how does this new sector feel differently in different bodies? So in what ways might the alternativeness of alternative proteins be exclusionary, as has been documented in many other previous alternative food networks? So I'm thinking here of Amy Breeze-Harper's work critiquing the mainstream framing of veganism in popular cookbooks and other media, which she shows is often rooted in a singular representative vegan body, which is typically a white, skinny, affluent, able-bodied female, and a singular idea of what qualifies as authentic motivations for vegan practice, which historically has been qualified as the liberation of animals or nature more broadly. Both of which, Harper argues, delegitimizes and excludes people of colour's experiences and choices from vegan narratives. Such narratives come from what Harper describes as the privileged perspective of a race-neutral and class-neutral understanding of vegan practice, where it is often assumed that everybody has easy access to fresh, raw, plant-based ingredients and the money and time to spend on them. Harper's work is part of a movement to challenge the monolithic culture of mainstream vegan narratives and to promote race-conscious vegan practices as a form of healing for racial health disparities amongst Black communities and as a way to decolonize their bodies from the legacy of racialized colonialism. The work of Julie Guthman and Alison and Jessica Hayes-Conroy also comes to mind when thinking about the ways that bodies deal with discourses about alternative foods. They have respectively led critical research on how discourses around alternative food movements like organics and slow food are felt by different demographics. Their work highlights how the image of whiteness and affluence that many of these movements portray can have either a charging or chilling effect on different people. So in other words, can sort of motivate or demotivate them to participate, which can then materialize in the considerable lack of racial and economic diversity that many food movements have. So this work collectively can help us to raise similar questions then of the alternative protein movement. So which bodies might be charged or chilled by the way alternative proteins are being framed? And what effects is this having on the diversity of the broader industry and the movement? So my aims today have been to think through how discourses about food futures are always entangled in materialities, and that this is important to reflect on as researchers of food and communication, because of the power that these entanglements have in shaping what is considered possible, who is included or excluded from the benefits of these futures, and what other alternative food futures are overlooked or delegitimized in the process. I want to just end on a final note about my particular case study. So the alternative protein sector is definitely becoming increasingly globalized, as you'll see from this recent map. So there's huge scope for more work to explore how much of the Silicon Valley model of future making that I've discussed today is being exported and replicated in other places, or whether there are unique entanglements with places, people, and networks of things in these different contexts. But also how resistances to food becoming more like software or being made to be like software might be being felt differently across different bodies and places. So I'll leave it there with that sort of cry for more research on the entanglements between the places, materialities, and discourses of food futures. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to discussing more in the Q&A.
Okay. Yeah, I suppose you can hear me, but not see me, I guess. Maybe Alexandra, if you stop sharing your screen, I guess this should fix the problem. Okay. Okay, thank you. It's been a fascinating talk and fascinating, really good overview of the topic. I really enjoyed it, and yes, I learned quite some new things. So, okay, we have already 2 questions for you. Maybe we can start with the first one, which is coming from Tanya Kamin. I can read it out loud, so people do not need to read the chat, but you can of course type your questions in the chat, and I will try to summarize them and sort them out and read it out to everybody, read it out loud to everybody. So Tanya asks, she says, she kind of congratulates you for the inspiring lecture, and then she asks basically that with, for instance, in vitro meat, we need a very, let's say, drastic change in consumer behavior. So her question would be, so what kind of consumers basically would be the ones that kind of, would be open to let's say, these novel foods? Maybe she probably kind of has in mind mostly in vitro meat, I guess, because plant-based alternatives are on the market already, so we kind of know who is eating them. So what would be your thoughts on this question?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. I think very early on, when I was doing my interviews with the industry, it became very clear that the way they were framing their products, they didn't want to use terms such as vegan, because what they saw their products as directly targeting meat eaters. So really the consumers that they have imagined throughout the emergence of this industry are the kind of most ardent carnivores. And it's really all about trying to make that switch as easy and as sort of almost unnoticeable as possible. So that goes to, the sensory aspects that I was talking about. So, the goal is that you don't even tell that you're eating a burger made of plants or cells, cultured cells. But it's also the kind of food practices around it. So there's been a real push and a lot of sort of ground made really by these new companies in getting their products into the aisles and the counters with conventional animal foods. So it really goes, as I say, to the broader practice of how we shop, so that you don't even have to enter new spaces. You don't have to go to the free from aisle or the vegan aisle in the shop. You want meat, you go to the meat counter, and the Beyond Burger, or potentially in the future, the cell cultured burger, is sitting alongside there. So really the consumers that they're imagining are meat eaters who want to eat meat, and these products are trying to deliver that and make it as easy as possible to make the switch.
Thank you. So you'll be kind of prospecting that vegans or vegetarians are not the target group here with plant-based meat, or the plant-based meat, yes, but in vitro meat, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it has been a conversation. I mean, it's certainly not excluding vegans and vegetarians, but a lot of times I've heard, the key players in the industry say, vegans and vegetarians sort of keep doing what you're doing. It's great. This is about trying to shift the broader population, I guess, of meat eaters. So yeah, there have been sort of perhaps more philosophical debates about whether culturing cells is vegan. So there's been a lot of debate about that, which is very interesting. But really, yeah, this is for the carnivores. And also, I guess, just a point on price points. So there have been criticisms that, some of these first generation, second generation products are still comparatively expensive. and they have tended to come to market through more niche retailers, so like Whole Foods, for example. But you know, with some of the plant-based burgers and stuff, they have gone to Target, Walmart, so they're sort of lower price point supermarkets. And I think there is a bigger conversation to be had that, yes, you know, these are prohibitively expensive for a lot of people at the moment. The argument from the industry is that, well, that will go down as we achieve bigger economies of scale, but also there is a kind of false economy existing with animal agriculture as it currently exists through you know, current subsidies. So the true cost of the livestock industry isn't really reflected in the final price that we see in the shops. So it's definitely a valid critique about going back to the question of who are the consumers. You know, at the moment they do tend to be in the West, sort of more affluent consumers, but we'll just have to see, I guess, how that potentially changes.
I have another question related to that, but maybe I'll bring it up later on. But here we have another question. Shibua, I hope I got this name pronunciation right, probably not, but yeah. She asks, please could you speak more about what you see pros and cons of development of this industry? And then she goes on, but maybe maybe you can ask this first, and then we try to develop.
Sure. So I think this is referring back to when I said the entry of kind of incumbent food industry coming in and buying up and buying into the alternative proteins. Now, this is something that I'm sort of grappling with as a critical food researcher, going sort of off the narratives, I guess, that's coming from the alternative protein industry. A lot of people who, you know, there are many people who have started these companies. They are vegans. They you know, come from that kind of mission-based approach, and what they perhaps see is a necessary step to partner with incumbent food industries to achieve, you know, rapid scale, to take advantage of the networks of power, the sort of political power that a lot of incumbent food, you know, incumbent livestock industry has a lot of political power in many countries. They have the infrastructure already in place, particularly sort of processing companies. So, you know, that offers potential to scale production much quicker. And so if you're coming from that kind of mission-based starting point of the goal is to try and reduce the number of animals suffering in the global food industry, then getting that scale of production quickly and the price, you know, price points down is the priority. And so, as I say, sort of partnering with perhaps the same companies that some of these founders might have been, you know, protesting outside a few years ago, or maybe avoiding when they've shopped. I think they see it as a kind of pragmatic partnership. I think there's also what I didn't talk about, this idea of how sort of non-human bodies are resisting the kind of food as software model. I think there has also been a recognition in recent years about the limits of trying to treat food as software. So, you know, you can scale a company like Facebook or Google sort of from Palo Alto in California. You know, you can have your big headquarters with your beanbags and stuff like that, and you can, you know, you can reach global scale almost entirely from that office. Obviously, there are still material networks and stuff to consider, like servers, but that kind of model doesn't work with food for all of the kind of reasons I was talking about. We have to recognize materiality, and so food involves so much materiality. It involves so much like supply chains, geographies, production networks, and so actually to try and certainly build a company that wants to create a product, an end product, it requires so much infrastructure. It requires so much land, you know, to get products across different geographies. So again, this is something that partnering with the incumbent food industry, I think, has been seen as that pragmatic kind of approach. The cons really come back to the point that I made. It's really this age-old debate about, you know, should we try and affect change by shouting from the outside, or should we try and affect change from within? And so depending on where you land on that question, I think for me, it can obviously be worthwhile. The more people you bring to the table, the more that you try and, you know, achieve sort of shared interests and shared visions for the world, the better. But I do think that what has happened, like with many technologies, and particularly, you know, the sort of Silicon Valley model, is that there's this kind of illusion of disruption. And so when you see headlines that praise the incumbents for, you know, they're going to invest in a plant-based burger, or they're bringing out a new line, what we need to be constantly checking is this just an addition effect? So are they just adding more products to their portfolios, or are they actually committing to replacing both the production of livestock, their current operations, and also the consumption, sort of trying to tackle the cultures of overconsumption that we have a lot of in richer nations? So this idea of addition versus replacement is something that I always come back to, and I think it's something that we have to hold all of the industry, you know, both incumbent and alternative protein industry, we have to hold them to that over the coming years, because we've already seen with, say, Burger King reported that actually by having, I think they have the Impossible Burger, what they've seen is not direct replacement from their customers. It's actually brought vegans and vegetarians into their shops. So it's more consumption, it's more expanded market opportunity for them. And that is a problem, because we really can't afford to produce more stuff and consume more stuff. So that's the biggest con or concern, I guess, for me, is this addition versus replacement. And we really need to be vigilant of that as critical researchers.
Thank you. Okay, Vasya is asking that 2035 for in vitro meat seems quite far away. And in your opinion, what could or should these new food technologies become, when should they become or will become mainstream in terms of commercial marketization of these products?
Yeah, so this is a really tricky question to ask. And I get asked it a lot, and I do try and refrain from, you know, predicting the future, crystal ball. But I think the way to answer that is it has been to take a lot of the projections with a little bit of pinch of salt. So there have been announcements by certain companies that, you know, it'll be on the market by 2018, for instance, and that didn't happen. So there is a kind of performance of saying they'll be the first, that kind of future projecting is often doing work in the present. So like I was talking about, to, you know, get investment to kind of build up hype. So just sometimes, you know, take these narratives, these projections with a little bit of pinch of salt. But having said that, you know, we had the Eat Just cultured chicken nugget launch in December 2020. So that was a massive event, and that sparked a lot of the media, you know, saying, oh, it's just around the corner. I think in thinking through, you know, when it will come to mainstream markets, it really depends on what you're, I guess, defining as mainstream markets. So I think certainly over the coming years, you will see more of these kind of niche sort of launch events. So a restaurant, you know, maybe in another country might have a period where they're selling a cultured meat product. But, you know, getting to the economies of scale to be able to be in mainstream supermarkets, for instance, I think is still a bit away. It's hard to make more concrete projections because so much of this activity is in private companies, and you know, they don't share really the status of their technologies. But yeah, I think there will be sort of multiple launches to multiple markets, and I think it will. My sort of humble projection is that it will trickle down from these kind of singular niche kind of restaurant launches, and it will take quite a while to get to lower price points in mainstream markets. So yeah, but we'll see. I think the 2035 prediction, certainly replacing all of animal-based agriculture, I think is ambitious. I think, I mean, it's going on record, I guess, but I think it would be unlikely that all of animal agriculture is replaced by that time, because you've seen, you know, even when food historically in places like UK has been its cheapest, you still see the niche, artisanal, higher price point meats and milks, that the markets are still there. So I think that market segmentation will remain. And I think what we'll actually see, going back to this addition effect, is in the short term, you will see just an expansion of protein offerings. So you'll have your plant-based, potentially your cell cultured, before it possibly starts to replace. But yeah, it's all constantly moving. So yeah.
I actually recently read in the newsletter I'm subscribed to, that FDA is planning to allow commercial use of in vitro meat by the end of 2021. So by the end of this year. We'll see. Maybe, yeah, but it's probably not going to go straight on the market. And
I think, and I think the question of where is also going to be a huge part of how and when the industry emerges in the next few years, because of which countries approve it for public sale. So the geography of it, so again, sort of wearing my geography hat, will be really interesting. And how quickly different countries kind of follow Singapore. That will be really interesting.
Yeah, because the EU has a very strict regulation on novel foods, so probably we are quite far away from this. Okay, let's move on. Ilona, she's asking, are you aware of any market research exploring current customer interest among meat eaters to switch to cell-based or plant-based alternatives? What about change in this over time? Okay.
Yeah, so there has been a lot of consumer-based work, both on, sorry, was that the cell-based? Oh, and plant-based. Yeah, so I mean, there is a longer tradition beyond, you know, the early 2010s of trying to understand what the barriers are for meat eaters to switch to, you know, older plant-based foods, but more recently, you know, there has been work looking specifically at the more recent products, and I think there's been an interest because previously the research showed things like, you know, texture, the taste, functionality, the ability to make the same meal, you know, so that you're not having to make a separate meal along with a meat dish, were all factors in why people may or may not choose to have plant-based alternatives. And so with this recent kind of the pushing of those sensory experiences, the fact that they're pushing to be in the same places and perform in the same ways as animal counterparts, I think, you know, there is a sense that in consumer research that more people are willing to try it. I think the shift in sort of demographics, so younger people often are reported as being more willing to try it, more motivated by environmental reasons. So things have, I think, certainly shifted, and there's interesting demographic kind of changes or increases maybe. So there's work to look out there. I think on the cell cultured side of things, like I said, I'm not aware of any research that has actually involved people eating cell cultured meats. So it comes back to the point I highlighted, where you do have to kind of contextualize those studies as it's just people talking about whether they would eat it, which doesn't always maybe reflect what they would actually do. But there has been a lot of different ways of asking people that question, and interesting kind of geographical differences as well. So some studies have found that people in China seem to be more willing to try it. It's sort of been speculated that there's maybe a greater, or this kind of meeting of food and technology isn't sort of seen as disgusting. There's also the sort of food safety is often a priority for Chinese consumers, and so the promise that this could, by culturing cells instead of growing animal bodies, that this could provide a much safer form of meat production. So that has been attributed to some of the consumer research. European countries, so I think France and Spain, have often exhibited the most kind of resistance. So often countries with a very strong food cultures that's very, rooted in place and in heritage, and the kind of, I guess, pastoral, farmer-led kind of image. And then there's also interesting kind of ideas about what counts as fresh and what counts as quality and natural. So yeah, the short answer is that there is a lot of consumer-focused work, which I'm happy to share with the person if they're interested. But it does get into a lot of the very interesting cultural and geographical differences.
Thank you. Okay, then we had another question or comment question by Laura, and she then said that most of it was already answered. But I still think that maybe she was caught by the notion of disgust or the yuck factor when it comes to this kind of, especially probably, okay, in vitro meat, but even more maybe another alternative, which are insects. So maybe you can reflect on it a little bit, on this yuck factor. When does it come from? Why people are so kind of, unwilling to maybe overcome it, or can it be a rational thing, a rational decision? I want to overcome my yuck, kind of my disgust, and still eat insects and in vitro meat, although I don't really like the idea. So
yeah, no, it's a great question, and this is an area that's really long interested me, because it's been such a part of the story since the beginning, like in the headlines, and there's been a lot of the kind of media stories where it's sort of put a microphone in someone's face and say, "Would you eat meat grown in a lab?" So there has been this idea that it is somehow perverting. It's the latest kind of perversion of human nature relationships, and I think if you shouldn't, well, I shouldn't say what you should or shouldn't do, but I think it's important and interesting to understand why that is, like I was talking about in the talk. I think certainly tastes change all the time, so it's not to say that the yuck factor will persist, that the same person who found it disgusting yesterday in a week, a month, a year's time won't find it disgusting. Tastes change. As we know, tastes are networked across so many different things, and often a lot of money is being spent in trying to change our tastes. So I think that's one part of the kind of journey of disgust that is really interesting, is to understand why maybe does the disgust change. In terms of insects, I think it's a slightly different discussed. It's more culturally and geographically situated. So particularly in a lot of Western countries, insects haven't really been part of food cultures. There's great work by Jonas House, who has kind of looked at how trying to make insects edible has sort of tried to follow the introduction of sushi into Western food cultures. But ultimately, I think he sort of says there are limits to sort of that analogy. And I think part of certainly what I would add to that argument is that a lot of insects can't fully replicate the food practices that make up a lot of Western food cultures. So, you can't carve an insect for Christmas dinner or, other holiday kind of food, events. So it comes down to a lot of the materiality of insects. They're smaller, they're good at being ground up and used more as an ingredient or as a flour. And also grounding them up gets rid of, the body parts, the eyes, the legs and stuff. So that in itself is a way of kind of making them more palatable. But I think there are extra hurdles, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say, with insects to make them acceptable. And it goes to not only the kind of sensory part of it, the taste, because they don't really taste very much. I've had some, they're kind of nutty, or they take on the flavour of really what they're with, but it's more the overall performance of eating them and what they can actually substitute. So I think there'll be more products of them ground up into protein bars and used as a kind of protein ingredient. But I think, there are perhaps more obstacles for them to be actual meat substitutes.
Thank you. We don't have any other questions. Maybe we still have 6 minutes if people want to ask something, or maybe we have some journalists present that I know they're really interested in your work. Actually, for the Slovene audience, there's been a long interview with Alexandra Sexton in Sobotna Priloga last Saturday. So you're welcome to read also this interview. Okay, if anybody else, if nobody else is going to kind of raise another question, I have one maybe the last one. So if we imagine this in vitro meat comes to the market, you showed how the industry started with a few, let's say, companies or spin-offs or startups investing and kind of developing these products for the market, and then how today there are so many. So if I got that right, my question would be how and for whom this meat will be accessible. Can we think maybe, let's say, meat accessibility or this alternative protein accessibility as maybe a problem for those who maybe will not be able to afford it? So what are your thoughts on that? Because on the other hand, we can hear a lot that people will have, or households will have their own, let's say, breweries in which they can grow their own lab-grown meat. So what are your thoughts on that? How is it going to be totally monopolized and, let's say, sold in a classic way, or consumers will have somehow the opportunity to raise in vitro meat themselves?
Yeah, so this is such a great question, and it really it speaks to the kinds of questions that I'm currently working through in my current project, because a lot of what will determine the different pathways, and I guess the diversity of pathways that this technology, and I'm talking specifically about the cultured meat, but it can also apply to some of the plant-based, high-tech plant-based as well, is it will be determined by at what scale production is both sort of economically and technically viable. So I'm involved in a current bid that is going to hopefully look at whether cultured meat could be something that could be implemented on different scales of farms. So could a farmer set up a cultured meat production facility on their farm? Is that a possibility? And we're going to look across different types of farming, different geographies around the UK, different scales, and what they're currently involved, you know, whether they're a livestock farmer, plant-based arable farmer. So the jury is slightly out. Certainly the industry, as a general direction, is pushing for biggest economies of scale as possible, just because, you know, that has the greatest chance of bringing the cost down. So, you know, and then I guess the other end of the spectrum, like you say, is having domestic appliances, which is a kind of imagined future for it as well. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that there is the potential, and there has been spoken about different kinds of scales, different kinds of pathways for how alternative protein production could be done, which then has knock-on effects about accessibility. I think, at least in the short term, the cost of setting up a cultured meat facility, I think I read one estimate that to build a pilot project, you know, would be upwards of $100 million, and that would be a relatively small pilot project. So, you know, a small scale sheep farmer in Wales doesn't have that kind of money to try and set one up. So I think in the short to medium term, it will be those who have the money, the capital to invest in these pilot projects. And I think we probably will see pushes towards larger scale production in the short term. But I think it's interesting to keep the different scales on the table and to see, you know, are there ways that we can support a kind of multi-scalar approach to it, which can then hopefully increase accessibility not only for eaters, for consumers in terms of price, but accessibility for producers. And that's not, you know, I'm talking almost exclusively about Western countries, but we also need to think, you know, globally to food producers around the world, because there's a big kind of question as to, does this signal a kind of another sort of colonial grab of protein production by the West that will leave the global South, you know, becoming just consumers of protein rather than producers. Now, a lot of, as I was talking about, a lot of the activity recently has been looking beyond the US and Europe, setting up pilot projects in different countries outside of the West, largely because of regulation. So yeah, it's a fluid and changing landscape, and yeah, the geographies of it will be interesting for accessibility, both for producers and consumers.
Thank you. I have so many more questions, but I think our time is up. Thank you, Alexandra, for being our guest. I think, yeah, the talk, the Q&A session, it was amazing, at least for me, because I'm also interested in this topic.